Welcome, wee ones, to Scottish Murders. Dawn will shortly be taking you through a solved or unsolved murder involving people from or living in Scotland. So get ready to hear about the darker side of bonny Scotland.
Oh, it'd been a good night, Stuart Gair thought as he sat back full and relaxed from his chip butty and from spending time in his room with his roommate Hector and another man, Danny, smoking, chatting and just having a laugh. Stuart Gair had only been released from prison 2 days earlier, but upon being released he had made the decision that was it. He wasn't going back. He was going to make a go of things this time. Stuart Gair was 26 years old, had a string of previous convictions for petty theft and robbery, and had spent time in prison. But now he was out. He was planning on going straight and was currently living in a bed and breakfast for people on the dole. On Tuesday, the 11th of April, 1989, Stuart had spent the night with his girlfriend Julie at their temporary home in the bed and breakfast, just off Great Western Road in Glasgow. The pair had been watching a baby for one of their friends who also stayed at the bed and breakfast with them, and the couple had watched a Clint Eastwood film once the baby had gone to sleep. The baby's mum had got back to the bed and breakfast about 10:45 p.m. and had brought bags of chips with her to say thank you. The chips had gone down well, but Stuart had wanted a chip butty, and so he asked the porter of the bed and breakfast if he would open the kitchen so he could get some rolls, which he agreed to. The trio ate their chips downstairs and chatted, and when the chips were finished, they decided to go to bed. While Julie also lived at the bed and breakfast, she wasn't allowed to share a room with Stuart due to the dole money they both received. But Stuart and Julie didn't mind too much, now that Stuart was out of prison and planning on making a go of things. That included getting a job and saving some money so that he and Julie could get their own place. For now, though, he shared a room with a man called Hector Wood. Hector was already in the room when Stuart went up to his room that night, not long after finishing his chip butty, and a man called Danny Marshall was there also, chatting to Hector. Stuart didn't really know either man that well, but they were okay, and so Stuart sat down in his bed, content after his feed, and joined in the conversation with the two other men, smoking and having a laugh. Danny left about half an hour later, but Hector and Stuart continued chatting well into the early hours of the morning, before eventually both men fell asleep, with Stuart feeling content and happy that his future was looking bright. While Stuart spent a quiet Tuesday night at his temporary home in the company of his girlfriend and acquaintances, 45-year-old Peter Smith was in Glasgow city centre. Peter lived with his mum in the small village of Plean in Stirlingshire, a 37-minute drive northeast of Glasgow city centre. According to the Herald newspaper on the 5th of November 2005, Peter was worldly wise, well-travelled and well-loved within his circle of family and friends. Peter was a former soldier, but in April 1989 he was the manager of a supermarket. Peter had a good relationship with his mother, and she had been the only one Peter had confided in that he was gay, which she had accepted without question. Apparently, his close friends and family also suspected that he was gay, but Peter never confided in them, only his mother. Peter also confided in his mother about his trips into Glasgow at night, not exactly what he was doing when he got there, but she knew he went there, and she was concerned about these trips, which is why, late in the evening of the 11th of April 1989, Peter's mother was waiting up for him to return home safe and sound after he told her that he would be visiting Glasgow again that night. But as the hours passed and Peter didn't arrive home, she became more and more concerned. Being gay back in 1989 would have been unimaginably frightening. A poll that researchers at the King's College London Policy Institute carried out, which compared data from 1989 Ipsos Mori polling on social attitudes to an identical poll conducted 30 years later, showed that in 1989, 40% of people in the UK taking part in the poll felt that homosexual relationships between consenting adults was morally wrong. When broken down, that was 45% of males and 35% of women that felt this was wrong. And so Peter likely would have been very keen to keep his secret just that. Due to Peter and many others feeling they had to or wanted to keep their homosexuality a secret, an option for Peter would be to seek out young male homosexual sex workers in lieu of a homosexual relationship, which created risk for both parties. On Tuesday, the 11th of April, Peter had gone to Glasgow to meet up with young male homosexual sex workers. However, instead, he met his killer. Peter had found himself in North Court Lane, which according to the Guardian newspaper in 1999 was a dingy alley next to the St Vincent Place toilets, where homosexual acts were a standard nighttime practice. At about 11 p.m. in this dingy alley, Peter was stabbed once in his chest. Bleeding profusely and struggling to stay upright, Peter somehow made the short journey from the alley to the St Vincent Place toilets, where he collapsed. Not long afterwards, at about 11:20 p.m, Peter was found by the toilet attendant, who had been locking up for the night, who immediately called an ambulance, and Peter was rushed to the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. I'm sick of being skint and not having a penny to my name. I'll be glad to get my dole money, thought Stuart on the morning after his quiet night in, as he made his way to collect his £150, or about $183, unemployment money that was to last him for the next 2 weeks. Stuart Gair had been born on the 27th of August 1963 in Reading in England, before as a young boy he moved with his mum Norma back to Scotland, where his mum was from. Stuart and his mum settled in the small village of Plean, a 37-minute drive northeast of Glasgow city centre. Stuart never knew his dad, as he had left long before Stuart was born. As a youngster, Stuart had dreams of becoming a pilot. However, by the time he was a teenager, he had left school and had become a petty thief, which continued into his 20s, with Stuart mainly living on the streets of Glasgow and spending time in prison periodically due to small-time petty crimes, only having been released from prison 48 hours previous to the 11th of April 1989, after serving 2 consecutive prison sentences. Stuart wasn't a stupid man though, with many saying that he was an intelligent, articulate man who could have been a poet if life had dealt him a better hand. But the life Stuart found himself living in April 1989 was one of being in and out of prison, finding himself without work, receiving benefit money from the government to get by, and living in temporary accommodation at a bed and breakfast where he shared a room with a relative stranger, and Stuart had turned to drugs to escape his life. After picking up his unemployment money on Wednesday morning, Stuart's plan had been to buy some drugs before heading back to the bed and breakfast. However, this plan was thwarted when he was picked up by police officers who wanted to question him about a robbery that had taken place, as Stuart was well known to the police by this time. At the police station, Stuart could afford to be a bit cocky, as he knew he definitely had not carried out the robbery the police were talking about, and he quickly told them this. However, Stuart's cockiness soon turned to confusion when the police found out that Stuart at one time had lived in Plean, the same village where Peter Smith lived with his mum, and began asking him if he knew this man, who he was told had been stabbed the previous evening in Glasgow city centre. "No, I've never heard of a Peter Smith." "Right, and can you tell us where you were about 11 p.m. last night, Stuart?" "Aye, I was at home. I live at a bed and breakfast just off Great Western Road." "And can anyone corroborate this, Stuart?" "Yeah, multiple people." Before Stuart went on to tell the police officers the events of the previous evening and who could give him an alibi. "Names, Stuart. We need names. We'll need to check this out. My girlfriend's called Julie Porter, my roommate's called Hector Wood, the other man is Danny Marshall, but I can't remember the porter's name, but him too. But I don't know anything about this Peter Smith being stabbed in town. I wasn't there. I've never heard of him." "Uh-huh. But you both lived in the village of Plean at some point together." "Okay, Stuart." "I never knew him. I don't know him." "All right, Stuart. Can you explain then why we have a witness that saw someone matching your description in the area where Peter was stabbed last night?" "No, because I wasn't there." "We think you were there, Stuart. We think you were the man who stabbed Peter. Do you know that he's in hospital right now, fighting for his life?" "I wasn't there. I didn't stab anyone." "Go ask my girlfriend, my roommate. I wasn't there." "Who was with you when you stabbed Peter, Stuart?" "What?" 2 police officers were in the area that evening, and have said they saw 2 suspicious men running from the St Vincent Place area at the time of Peter's stabbing. They're doing a photo fit of one of these men right now. We will find the man you were with, Stuart, so you might as well tell us." "I wasn't there. I didn't do this. How can I tell you anything?" No matter what Stuart said, even the fact that he had given the names of 4 people who could categorically say that he was at the bed and breakfast with them at the time Peter was stabbed, that he was with them all night, the police officers refused to believe Stuart. and they seemed determined that they were going to find enough witnesses to prove that he was in Glasgow city centre that night and that he had stabbed Peter Smith. And so, Stuart was remanded in custody and sent to Barlinnie prison to wait until enough evidence and/or witness statements could be taken to prove that he was there and that he had done this. While Stuart was annoyed at being sent to prison on suspicion of stabbing this Peter Smith, he knew he had not been in Glasgow city centre that evening and had not stabbed this man. He knew he had a cast iron alibi, so he knew he wouldn't be held in prison long. So much for never going back to prison, he thought. That didn't last long, but he held on to the fact that he hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't stabbed anyone, so he'd be out soon enough, and he could start that new life he had promised himself and Julie. But how wrong he would be. While Stuart was in prison, thinking it wouldn't be long before he was back out, outside, police officers were doing their best to ensure that Stuart would be staying behind bars for a very long time. Police had spoken to young men that had been found in the area immediately after Peter's stabbing, and apparently many had seen the perpetrators of the stabbing. The photo fit of the second man that PC Shirley Marnock had created had also been circulated, with a description that one of the perpetrators was about 5'8", or about 1.72 metres, and the other was about 5'10 inches, or about 1.77 metres. The police had also made appeals in newspapers asking anyone to come forward if they had been in the area on the evening of the stabbing and if they had seen anything, to which a man had responded that he felt he could identify at least one of the perpetrators. So feeling confident that the witnesses they had found would be able to identify Stuart as being one of the perpetrators, on the 18th of April, 6 days after Peter was stabbed, an identity parade was held at the police station. Stuart, of course, was to appear in the parade. As the door was opened for Stuart to take his place in the lineup, he noted that all of the other men in the lineup were far shorter than him. Stuart stood at 6'1 inches, or about 1.85 metres. Bearing in mind, the police officers said that the men they had seen were 5'8 and 5'10, about 1.72 and 1.77 metres, respectively. Despite Stuart pointing this height difference out, he was ignored and told to take his place. At the identity parade that day, to try to identify the men they had seen at the scene of the stabbing, was 19-year-old Brian Morrison, who had been near the toilets at St Vincent Place, and had said he saw two men come out of the toilets and head in the direction of North Court Lane, which was a known homosexual area. Brian had said in a statement to the police that he would definitely be able to identify the two men he saw, and that one of them had threatened him. He too described the men as being around 5'10 inches or 1.77 metres, that they wore dark leather jackets and both had been wearing trainers. However, despite Brian's confidence, he was unable to pick out Stuart at the identification parade and instead picked out a stand-in. Next up was 25-year-old Alan Gillen, who had responded to the newspaper appeal and who had been sitting in his parked car near St Vincent Place on the night of the stabbing, and reported seeing two men running away from the scene, and that one of the men had been wearing white training shoes, a black leather jacket and denims, and he thought this man was either 5'6 or 7 inches, about 1.67 metres. He later changed his mind though, and said that he thought the man was actually 5'8 inches, or 1.72 metres instead. He said he could not describe the second man in any detail at all, other than to say that both men may have been about 20 to 25 years old. Despite Stuart being 6'1 inches or 1.85 metres, Alan picked Stuart out of the lineup. Not 100% conclusive, but enough that following the identity parade, Stuart was told he was being charged with the attempted murder of Peter Smith before being taken back to prison. Back in his cell, Stuart was in shock. How could this be happening? I didn't do this. How could I have been picked from a lineup? But he would have tried to reassure himself that this was just a mistake, and it would all be cleared up once the police had spoken to his girlfriend and roommates at the bed and breakfast, before wondering why they hadn't already done that. No, everything will be okay. I mean, I didn't do it, so how can I be guilty? It'll be fine. However, on the 26th of April, 8 days after the first identity parade, Stuart found himself in court, charged with the attempted murder of Peter Smith. At this time, Stuart of course said that he was innocent of this charge. Things were getting serious now. And then 2 days later, Stuart found himself at another identity parade. This time, it was the turn of the two police officers, PC Shirley Marnock and PC Lewis Fulton, and two more young men that police had found in the area on the night of the stabbing, teenagers David Smith and Andrew Learmonth, to try to make an identification. No longer feeling confident, Stuart took his place in the lineup, where both PC Shirley Marnock and PC Lewis Fulton immediately identified Stuart as being someone they had seen in the area on the night of the stabbing. However, neither David Smith or Andrew Learmonth were able to identify Stuart Gair from the lineup. Again, not conclusive, but again, Stuart was taken back to prison and left. And as if all this wasn't bad enough, things became even worse. While Peter was still alive on arrival to the hospital, and he fought so hard for his life, on the 29th of April 1989 at 10:25 p.m, 18 days after he was so cruelly stabbed in the chest, he sadly passed away after contracting bronchopneumonia due to the stab wound to his heart. Peter left behind his distraught mother and sister, who were both determined to get justice for their beloved son and brother. While this was desperately sad for Peter, his mum, his sister and his friends, there was also one other person this was desperately sad news for, Stuart Gair, as within 24 hours of Peter Smith dying, the police had visited Stuart in prison and charged him with Peter Smith's murder. While Stuart knew he was not Peter's murderer, he was not in Glasgow city centre that evening, and he had witnesses who could give him an alibi. For whatever reason, the police were not listening to him. They would not take into account his solid alibi. They seemed on a mission to make sure Stuart went to prison for the murder of Peter Smith. But why? Yes, Stuart was a petty thief who had been in and out of prison. Yes, he dabbled in drugs. Yes, he didn't have a job and wasn't really doing anything with his life. But did he deserve this? Why were the police doing this to him? And what about the real murderer? Where was he? Why were the police not looking for him? So many questions rattled around Stuart's head as he sat in prison, realising that his bright future of making something of his life, of changing his life and not going back to prison, was beginning to fade. But surely he couldn't be found guilty at trial. I mean, he hadn't done this. He had not done this. It would be okay. And yet, things were about to get even worse for Stuart. On the evening of Peter Smith being stabbed, a number of eyewitnesses, including two police officers, reported seeing two men fleeing the area. The police had charged Stuart with Peter's murder, but if eyewitnesses were to be believed, there was another man yet to be found and charged. Enter William MacLeod. On the 6th of May 1989, a week after Peter Smith had died and Stuart Gair had been charged with his murder, William MacLeod was in Buchanan Street bus station, a 9-minute walk south from where Peter was found, where he was approached by a police officer. The police officer showed William the photo fit of the man seen by PC Shirley Marnock near the scene and asked him if he thought he looked like the photo fit. William looked at the photo fit and replied that, yeah, he supposed so, a wee bit. At which point, William was asked to go to the police station to be questioned. According to the Herald newspaper, on the 5th of November 2005, William was an insecure, vulnerable man. And when the police had finished interviewing William at the police station, he had confessed that he was with Stuart Gair that night and that Stuart had stabbed Peter just before William had run away. He also advised that Stuart was wearing a black leather jacket or sweatshirt, jeans and white training shoes that night. Following William being charged as Stuart's co-accused and sent to Berlin prison to await the trial, William took part in a number of identity parades, where Brian Morrison, David Smith and Andrew Learmonth, who had apparently witnessed the men fleeing the scene of the crime but had not been able to pick out Stuart Gair in the lineup, were also not able to pick William out of the lineup. However, when it was the turn of the two police officers, PC Shirley Marnock and PC Lewis Fulton, who had reported seeing two suspicious men in the area, and PC Shirley Marnock had been able to create a photo fit, both picked out William MacLeod as being the man they had seen that night, along with Stuart Gair. The next day, William appeared in court to face the charge of murder, where he retracted everything he had said that incriminated Stuart and himself, telling the judge that the police had pressured him to lie. However, he was not believed and was charged as Stuart's co-conspirator and sent to Barlinnie prison. It wouldn't be until William arrived at Barlinnie prison that he finally met his co-accused, Stuart, for the first time. The men didn't know each other, had never met before that, and neither man was in Glasgow city centre on the evening Peter Smith had been stabbed, except William MacLeod didn't have an alibi for his whereabouts. However, with both men knowing that they hadn't done the crime they were being accused of, they felt a little more optimistic that surely a jury couldn't find them guilty of a murder that neither had committed. Their solicitors would see to that. It would be fine, they hadn't done this. And as it turned out, William MacLeod would be fine, as on the 23rd of August 1989, the day before Stuart and William's trial was due to commence, all charges were dropped against William MacLeod, and he was now going to be the prosecution's main witness, in return for him saying at the trial that it had been Stuart that had murdered Peter Smith. "You're joking," was Stuart's response to his solicitor, who had just told him this fact minutes before the murder trial was due to begin on Wednesday the 24th of August. "That can't be right though. I only met William for the first time in Barlinnie. Why is he saying that?" "I don't know, Stuart, but it's not looking good. He's the prosecution's main witness now." "Aye, but I've got multiple witnesses who can corroborate that I was nowhere near where the murder happened. I was at the bed and breakfast all night, and that's our special defence that I've got an alibi. No way will the jury be able to find me guilty of this. I didn't do it." "I'll do my best, Stuart, but just be prepared." And so the trial began, with the first witness to take the stand being none other than William MacLeod. But it didn't go quite the way the prosecution had thought, when once on the stand, William MacLeod stated that the police had asked him to frame Stuart Gair, saying he didn't know Stuart. He said that he had been in the area on the evening and around the time Peter had been murdered, but he had seen nothing and was with nobody. Not the best start for the prosecution. However, following a lunch break and being told the seriousness of perjury, William returned to the witness box and his story had changed. He was now swearing that Stuart was the man who had been with him that night and that he'd stabbed Peter. However, when he was cross-examined, his story changed again. This time he said that he felt under pressure by the police to point the finger at Stuart, but that he didn't know Stuart, he wasn't with him that night and had not seen him that night. When William left the stand, he was charged with perjury and held in the cells overnight. The following day, William took to the stand again. This time he stated again that he did know Stuart, he had been with him that night, and that they had planned to rob Peter Smith, and that he and Stuart had taken Peter down the dingy alley of North Court Lane to do this. However, he said that then Stuart had pulled a knife out and stabbed Peter, and that he had turned and ran away. Upon being asked why he kept changing his story, he said, "I'm scared, that's all, really scared," going on to say that he had been threatened in prison by other prisoners as well as Stuart, but on the way to court that morning a detective had told him just to tell the truth. As Stuart sat and listened to the constant changing story of William MacLeod in the witness box for 2 days, he began to relax a little bit. He was sure William's testimony would either be thrown out as unreliable, or at the very least the jury would not be able to believe a word he said. How could anyone believe him one way or the other when he kept changing his story? But his testimony wasn't thrown out, and his story of the police making him implicate Stuart Gair to secure a conviction was not believed. The judge did say, though, that William had been an appalling witness, and that without supporting evidence of other witnesses, the jury would have no rational basis for accepting William as credible or reliable. Which is when the 3 teenagers, Brian Morrison, David Smith and Andrew Learmonth, who had apparently witnessed 2 men running from the scene, each took to the stand, and their testimonies backed up William MacLeod's account. First on the stand was 19-year-old Brian Morrison, whose testimony would be vital in backing up what William MacLeod had said in implicating Stuart Gair. On the stand, Brian Morrison reiterated what he had initially said to the police about seeing two men come out of the toilets in St Vincent Place and head in the direction of North Court Lane, where Peter was stabbed, and added that he had a good look at the two men, backing this up by picking out in the courtroom Stuart Gair and William MacLeod as being the two men he had seen that night, despite not being able to pick out either man in the identity parades. This testimony was perfect. It gave credibility to William's testimony and swayed the jury in the prosecution's favour, despite Brian breaking down in tears whenever he was asked a difficult question. However, there was something that the prosecution was keeping quiet. They had information that would put into doubt the credibility of Brian Morrison's testimony, not something the prosecution wanted to do, and so they did not pass this information on to Stuart's defence team, and in essence, not allowing Stuart's solicitor to challenge Brian Morrison's testimony and put doubt into the minds of the jury, and give Stuart a fair trial. While Brian Morrison's initial statement to the police had been that he could definitely identify the two men he had seen that night leaving the toilets on St Vincent Place and heading towards North Court Lane. What wasn't disclosed, though, was that Brian had given a second statement to the police in the weeks after his first statement, and this time he had said that, "I have to tell you that a lot of what I have already told the police is not the truth, and I made up some of it to attract attention to myself." The question is, did he make up some of it, or did he make up all of it? This second statement wasn't all that was being withheld. Also attached to the prosecution paperwork for the trial, which the defence saw nothing of despite it being absolutely vital to Stuart receiving a fair trial and his solicitors being able to put up a better fight and put doubt in the minds of the jury, was a note which stated that Brian Morrison had at one point signed himself into a psychiatric hospital, with the note going on to say that Morrison and his vivid imagination certainly set the police off on the trail of a red herring initially. With Brian's testimony given and accepted without challenge by the defence, who had no idea that information was being withheld, the next witnesses to take to the stand who could also back up William's testimony were teenagers David Smith and Andrew Learmonth. Both men recounted how they had seen two men running from the toilet area at St Vincent Place on the night Peter Smith was stabbed, and when asked if they could pick out either man in the courtroom that day, David Smith identified Stuart Gair as being one of the men but didn't recognise William MacLeod, and Andrew Learmonth identified William MacLeod as being one of the men but didn't recognise Stuart Gair. However, neither David Smith or Andrew Learmonth were able to identify Stuart Gair or William MacLeod at their respective identity parades. Alan Gillen, who had been sitting in his car in the area on the evening of the stabbing and had seen two men running away, was next to take to the stand to repeat his statement. When Alan was asked if he could pick out the men from the courtroom that he had seen that night, Alan pointed to Stuart Gair, as he had done in his identity parade. When PC Shirley Marnock, who had been able to develop a photo fit of someone similar to William MacLeod as acting suspiciously and fleeing the area that night, took to the stand and was asked if she could identify either of the men she had seen that night as being in the courtroom, she picked out Stuart Gair and William MacLeod, just like she had done at the identification parade. However, when PC Lewis Fulton took to the stand and was asked the same question, where he could pick out Stuart Gair in the courtroom as being one of the men he had seen that night, he was unable to pick out William MacLeod, despite William sitting in the front row of the public benches. PC Fulton had picked both Stuart Gair and William MacLeod out at their identification parades. Stuart, while being anxious, still felt confident that he wouldn't be convicted of this awful crime, simply because he didn't do it. Plus, multiple witnesses who could provide him with an alibi would be taking the stand soon. That should do it. However, Stuart was in for a surprise. While the porter at the bed and breakfast accommodation took to the stand and gave Stuart an alibi as being there at about 10:45 p.m. the evening Peter was stabbed, not one other of his witnesses were called. Not his girlfriend Julie, or his roommate Hector, or even Danny, the other man Stuart had been in the company of around the time of the murder. When the lead detective took to the stand, they said that while Stuart may have been at the bed and breakfast at 10:45 p.m. and was seen by the porter, The detective felt that after this, Stuart had left the bed and breakfast without anyone noticing, either got a taxi or bus to Glasgow city centre, which would take about 15 minutes, and Stuart had made his way to St Vincent Place, where it just so happened he came across Peter Smith, where he stabbed him before running away to get another taxi or bus to take him back to the bed and breakfast 15 minutes away, and then snuck back into the bed and breakfast without anyone seeing him or realising that he had gone. As Stuart sat and listened to this incredulous pack of lies, he said to a solicitor sitting beside him why he hadn't called his other witnesses who had been with him continually from early evening until the early hours of the morning. Plus, Stuart said, I was skint. I didn't get my unemployment money until the following morning. I couldn't afford to get a bus or taxi into town or back. However, Stuart's solicitor had nothing, said nothing, and Stuart was beginning to worry. This wasn't how it should be. This wasn't how he thought it would go. Who were all these supposed witnesses who had seen him in the area that evening, and why were they lying? What was going on? Forensic evidence, such as an ornamental knife that was said to be the murder weapon, was shown to the jury and linked to Stuart Gair. It was also mentioned that following Stuart's denim jeans being examined, it had shown a smear of blood at the mouth of the right hip pocket. Apparently, though, Stuart had said that they had been washed in carbolic. A large directional spot of blood was also observed on the back of the heel of his left training shoe, and the blood group matched that of Stuart and Peter Smith. None of the supposed forensic evidence was gone into in great detail. It was presumably felt that there were enough witnesses to seeing Stuart there that night that would convict him. Why labour forensics at a time when it was still in its infancy and not relied upon? After 5 days of trial, on the 30th of August 1989, Stuart was found guilty by a jury's 8-7 majority and was handed down a life sentence. It was reported that some jury members wept as the verdict was read out. Stuart, while being in complete shock, was then led away to begin his life sentence in prison for a murder he did not commit. Now, you'd think that might be the end of Stuart's story. However, it has only just begun. That is the end of part 1. Part 2 of Stuart Gair's Miscarriage of Justice story will be released a week after this episode. If you'd like to know more about miscarriages of justice in Scotland, please visit mojoscotland.org or scottishmurders.com.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.